Jeff, on to weightier matters. Not to say the IPL isn't a hefty competition, but the next topic we're going to discuss is quite serious, and that's the New Zealand cancellation of their tour in Pakistan on the morning of the first one-day international. They were already out there, and they were ready to roll. This is a difficult conversation for similar reasons that when we went through the Afghanistan situation last week, we tried to do so looking at all points of view without being too hot takey, and I think that we will try and do the same thing here rather than offering conclusions, because as I put on Twitter as soon as this news broke, I am not qualified to talk about the security situation in Pakistan, nor is anyone. It doesn't stop a lot of people trying, doesn't stop a lot of the usual suspects asserting what they think to be true and so on, but on the basis of security advice, New Zealand didn't proceed with that tour. Now, I think to set this up, a lot of Australian listeners to this podcast should remember that Australia have pulled out of a lot of tours on security grounds before. Top of my head, 96 World Cup in Sri Lanka, 2002 in Pakistan, not long after the Karachi bombings, which was the year after. That was in 2001, wasn't it? Or early 2002 when New Zealand had to leave the previous time. 2002 in Zimbabwe, 2008 in Pakistan as well, and there'll be others that I can't think of from the top of my head. You want to go back further, there's England's tour in 1984 in India, which was beset by security issues. So, and then of course 2009, the horrible events of 2009, which put Pakistan in the wilderness as far as hosting international cricket for the better part of a decade. So it's not like this is the first time this has happened, Jeff. It just feels more serious because in the last few years, we had South Africa, or even the last year, South Africa, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, the West Indies, Zimbabwe, all go to Pakistan, and England were very, very positive about going to Pakistan. Look, they might still go. For all we know, there'll be news on this between recording and publishing, but England haven't formally made a decision. But they were right on the front foot about returning to Pakistan with both a men's and women's team this October. So it's I suppose, less about the act of not going on a tour because of security concerns and more how far down the path I feel like we got with Pakistan. This feels abrupt, and of course it's expressly related to what's happening in Afghanistan.
That's the concern, is that it becomes a domino effect. Once one team pulls out, then there's so much more pressure on the other boards to say, well, do they know something we don't know? Will we be putting our players at risk if we insist on going when others haven't? And yeah, look, Australia have a history of it. I think we can sort of forget how big a deal some of these things were as well. When Australia refused to play in Colombo in Sri Lanka in 1996, that was at the height of the Tamil-Sinhalese war. There were terrorist attacks going around. There was military responses to it. There was violence all over at different times. But it was still taken as a massive insult by the entire Asian bloc that was hosting that World Cup that Australia would refuse to play in Colombo, and there was a very staunch refusal to countenance rescheduling those games or anything of the sort. The same thing happened in 2003 at the World Cup in Africa, and it was New Zealand then who refused to play in Nairobi in Kenya because, again, they had some sort of government intelligence that said that there were terrorist operations in Nairobi. Why they would have been targeting the New Zealand cricket team was a question that they were never able to adequately answer, but they refused to play. The ICC refused to relocate the game, and they forfeited that match and forfeited the points. But that was coming a year after they'd had the bomb go off outside their hotel in Pakistan, so they were very touchy about how they were going to manage that any sort of situation where there was any sort of danger. So New Zealand have a track record in this regard, and I guess that's the first thing that it makes me think of is this sort of overcautiousness that is then going to cause a cascade of problems for Pakistan. But of course we've got no way of knowing what the actual intelligence is and whether it is excessive caution or whether it's something more tangible than that.
Yeah, so a couple of things here. First of all is that you are right, it is unlikely that it will ever become public what this advice said explicitly. That would be irresponsible. It wouldn't be prudent for them to share the intelligence they've been gathering. So yeah, that's one point here. The other point is that Reg Dickinson has been advising the New Zealand team. Advising Cricket New Zealand rather. He, Australian based from Queensland, I think. He also looks after the ECB's security assessments, like an independent kind of oversight on all of this. And he used to work with the PCB, so he knows this inside and out. And that would lead one to the conclusion that if he's advised NZC not to proceed here, that the probability of England sending 2 teams in a month from now must be pretty slim. And I'm sure the influence that will have on Australia. So you mentioned the domino effect. I said exactly that on Twitter when this news came through. It'll give sort of political cover for England if they don't want to go. And I don't mean that in a pejorative way, like they're looking for a reason to get out of it. But if there was any hesitancy about England going, the ECB have now got, that shield of New Zealand having not gone, and Australia has a pretty dreadful track record with this stuff at the best of times. So I'm sure they'll slip into that stream as well in the fullness of time. So there's all of that going on. My own insight from this is that going back to 2008 when Australia didn't go to Pakistan, where they were scheduled to go in the March of that year. They didn't because of violence around the election in Pakistan in February 2008. The Australian government were involved in briefing Cricket Australia. Essentially, DFAT were working with CA, providing their best advice after there were a number of suicide bombing events which threw the whole tour into disarray. And at the time, the government and the Foreign Minister, Stephen Smith, backed in CA quite strongly, saying that, it's important to sort of take the advice of the government where you can. So there will be, and the reason I cite that is there will be a collaboration going on there, I'd imagine, between New Zealand Cricket, their independent advice they're receiving, their foreign service, their intelligence agencies. This isn't like a decision made in a vacuum. There's a lot of different inputs. I think that from an integrity perspective, I'm willing to accept on face value that they were trying to play that series, especially given they were already there. Bit different if they weren't there and it was on the eve of flying out, but they were willing. They were playing that day. I mean, they pulled out the morning of the game. So yeah, so quite a lot to consider there about, I suppose, the process, Jeff. Like, there's no perfect answer, as with a lot of these things. It's just a case of trying to get an understanding of how we've reached this point.
I suppose if I take the cynical view of not necessarily this specific case, but more broadly the way these kind of processes work, it's a bit like if I'd use the analogy of defamation lawyers at a newspaper. Anytime an article goes to legal, they have to find something to take out of it in order to justify the fact that they have a job, because the level of risk aversion gets so high that there is then a fear from the people who've got that job that if they don't make a recommendation and something does happen, then it's even more on them. That they bear too much responsibility to countenance taking even an acceptable level of risk. And so that is the thing that I wonder about when you've got people employed as security consultants, risk assessors, all that sort of stuff. Is there pressure on them to come up with something that sounds interesting, to not make something up, but to give something more weight than it should have? And if they do that, is that then enough to sway a nervous cricket board, for instance, who are not experts in the field and who don't necessarily know how to weigh up or assess that information? They can only take the information that they're given, and if it is presented in a certain way, maybe it makes them inclined to say, well, we can't do this. Yeah,
well, that was certainly the criticism of Cricket Australia back in 2015 when they didn't go to Bangladesh. It was that they were looking for a reason not to go. That it suited them very well at the end of a long Ashes campaign to not have to splice in 2 test matches against Bangladesh at the time. And I mean, that's questioning the integrity of someone like Sean Carroll, which I'm not going to do. I'm just not going to do that. I'm not going to say that someone that had that role for that long was like effectively writing a sexed up dossier. That's not what my point is. But there were people
deliberate.
No, but I'm just I get your point.
Whether there's a tendency to go too far one way.
Yeah, an implicit bias to go one way, right? For the you get something and you can, but at the time there were people who were making the criticism that, well, they just didn't want to go and they found a way not to go, right? And here we are sort of 6 years later, and that wouldn't feel like an unsafe country to visit. No one's had a problem visiting Bangladesh since then, as far as I'm aware. Australia was the outlier in that situation. But this isn't really about Australia at the moment. It's about what's going on with New Zealand and England in the immediate term. And I mean, I saw Ramiz Raja.
Pakistan more broadly, where Afghanistan is boiling over, the interrelationship between those two countries is deep. It's detailed. There's a sort of singular ecosystem almost. That so much of the last 20 years has involved a spilling back and forth over. The border is notional in that sort of area. The growth of Islamic extremism of the sort that flourishes in Afghanistan has a lot of it's been grown in Pakistan. There's also the inverse, where a lot of people who are opposed to that sort of thing have had to flee Afghanistan and ended up living in Pakistan.
Yep.
So the conflict continues. Some of the absolute horrors that we've seen visited upon Pakistan's own people by Pakistani militants and extremists over the past couple of decades, we all remember those with an absolute shudder. And so it's certainly never far from being possible that sort of thing can happen again. It probably will happen again. And conditions are rife at the moment for that to go off.
Yeah, and that's where you feel for, the PCB, Ramiz Raja, who has just been appointed to the position of chairman of the PCB, I think it is, was very strong in his wording about how they will take this to the ICC. They will fight this. They will try and get NZC to pay a price for this, because in his eyes, or their eyes, the PCB, this is not a justified decision on the basis of what they are reporting back to New Zealand, and the conditions, and I suppose all of the different safeguards that they would have issued to New Zealand to get them there in the first place. They feel this is an affront. So, and if you're the PCB, you'd be bloody petrified about what this means, because they've been isolated for the better part of a decade once before. They were also isolated back in 2001, 2002. Of course, the horrors of the 2008 Mumbai massacre, followed by what happened in early 2009 with the Sri Lankan team. It builds up a perception, and I hate it when I posted about this the other day, and I hate the ultranationalism from non-Pakistanis who just assert that Pakistan are a bunch of terrorists and stuff. It's disgraceful when people behave in that way, and by that I mean just carte blanche suggesting that an entire nation of people can't be trusted to host international cricket because they're all terrorists. It's just not on, and you get this kind of backlash. And I feel desperately for the many wonderful cricket people, Jeff, that you and I have met from Pakistan, who would love nothing more than to have international cricket return there, and they are desperate for it, only for it to now look like it's going to leave the country again for an indefinite stretch of time. I unfortunately can't see any other outcome after the decision taken last week. And even though England owe Pakistan an enormous debt of gratitude,
big time.
Pakistan came out last year in the middle of COVID when there was no vaccine. The West Indies likewise, Australia and Ireland too. They came out to this country in the middle of the plague with no protection, and anyone could have got ill at any time, and miraculously they didn't. The ECB and other countries owe Pakistan for doing the right thing. That's why I think the ECB really actually wanted to discharge their duty on this. But, are they going to receive advice that's radically different to NZC? I don't know. We got told there would be a decision made within 48 hours. That's 72 hours ago. And apparently the board are yet to meet to finalise the decision from the ECB. As I say, maybe between us recording and publishing that might have changed. But it does, I suppose, reinforce that they are thinking about this long and hard.
It does make you think that maybe there's some chance they will still go. If they were going to bail, you would have thought they'd bail a bit sooner than this. But had New Zealand and England gone ahead as planned, Australia would pretty much have had to go, because they would have been outliers. But even if England go now, given that New Zealand have already pulled out, Australia won't. I guarantee you Australia's series will be in the UAE next year, and that's without having spoken to anybody about it. I couldn't be more sure that that's what will happen. So yeah, like you say, I just desperately feel for people in Pakistan who want to see some level of normality in this regard, but who just don't have that. It doesn't seem possible.
I predicted at the start of the show that we would have news about the England-Pakistan series by the end, and lo and behold, a statement for immediate
Lay
release
it
from
on
the
me.
ECB. The ECB has a long-standing commitment to tour Pakistan as part of the Future Tours program. Earlier this year, we agreed to play 2 additional T20 World Cup warm-up games in Pakistan, blah, blah, blah. The ECB board convened this weekend to discuss these extra England women's and men's games in Pakistan, and we can confirm that the board has reluctantly decided to withdraw both teams from the October trip. Blah. The mental and physical well-being of our players and support staff remains our highest priority, etc., etc., etc. There's the added complexity for our men's T20 squad. We believe that touring under these conditions would not be ideal preparation for the World Cup, where performing well remains a top priority for 2021. We understand that this decision will be a significant disappointment to the PCB, who have worked tirelessly to host the return of international cricket in their country, their support of English and Welsh cricket over the last 2 summers, etc., etc., etc. What did it say here? We are sincerely sorry for the impact this will have on cricket in Pakistan and emphasise our ongoing commitment to our main touring plans there in 2022. So, right, from that, they're essentially saying in 2022 they are committed to going there as part of the Future Tours program, men's FTP. And they're saying here that in addition to that, before the World Cup, they agreed going to Pakistan for the men's team in October and then adding a short women's tour with double headers alongside the men's game. And then they've gone away to consider the extra men's games and withdrawn the October trip. What I'm struggling to piece together here is, what about the women's games? Because they're not just for... They're not preparing. I mean, they're for they were in the. They're not just T20 double headers. They had 3 one-dayers scheduled as well.
But they're withdrawing both teams. So
no, they're withdrawing both teams, but it's not. It's not as straightforward as
Yeah.
We were just playing a couple of T20s before the World Cups. The women's tour was more. It was more advanced than the men's tour. More wide-reaching.
More chunky.
So I suppose what they're saying here is because of the how taxing it would be from a mental perspective going to Pakistan right now. So they haven't really cited security concerns, interestingly. So, I mean, there's going to be...
It's more like our players will be too stressed out because they'll be worried because of New Zealand pulling out. Seems to be the subtext there.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? And then they reiterate at the bottom their ongoing commitment to our main touring plans there for 2022. So they're sort of treading the tightrope there a little bit.
Yeah, we're definitely still going to come. But
we're going to come, but we're going to come next year.
Yeah,
by which time the Australian team would have pulled out. I suppose they bought themselves space.
Yeah, they bought themselves time to have more security assessments. It's basically the cricket board equivalent of the text that you send when you haven't left home yet, but you're like, oh no, I'm definitely on the way. Yeah, just getting to the tram stop now. Yeah, no, I'm coming. I'll just be I'll be there at 10 instead of 8. That sort of thing. You're
still ironing a shirt and you haven't got out the door, but you said you're at a tram stop. No, I agree with all of that. So time will tell what that will mean, I suppose.